Hello everyone, welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. So today is 29th April and we have few important news articles for today's discussion. So there are set of news articles that we are going to discuss today. So they include the inequality, growing levels of inequality in India and how inequality is a concern that we must address in India, right? So growing inequalities actually leads to the poor concentration or poor distribution of wealth and concentration of wealth in the few hands. And secondly, we will also discuss RBI's monetary policy and its role in green growth transition and what RBI has been doing to ensure green growth, because it is very important to understand the impact of climate change on economic growth and development. So therefore, in this context, we will understand the role of RBI in ensuring green growth and that facilitating in economic growth and economic development. So after that, we will also briefly understand the concept of cyclonic and anticyclonic disturbances and how these anticyclonic disturbances over the Indian Ocean are actually responsible for increased presence of heat waves or heat wave like conditions over the Indian subcontinent, especially on India. And after that, we will also understand the growing trade deficit between India and China. So that is a huge concern that we must address. So this trade deficit amounts to around 110 billion US dollars between India and China, and recent times we have increased the imports from China. So we'll understand all those important news articles one by one. So before discussing them, let's try to solve yesterday's practice question. So the question was, which of the following statements about the Miyawaki method are true? So the options given here are: it is a traditional farming technique used in Japan for centuries. And second statement says it is a method used for rapid forestation by planting a mixture of native plants or nature forestation, planting a mixture of native plant species closely together. Option C, it primarily focuses on the use of chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides. Option D, it designates to grow only one type of plant to ensure the uniformity. So the correct answer for this question is option B. So that is, it is a method used for rapid forestation by planting a mixture of native plant species closely together. Now please understand, this Miyawaki method is actually named after a Japanese botanist, his name Akira Miyawaki, and who invented this Miyawaki method of forestation. And in this forestation, the Miyawaki method actually involves planting several species of trees are very close to together in a small land. So that involves the Miyawaki method of forestation. So therefore, plants actually draw nutrients from each other and they become healthy, and over a period of time that a small patch of land with a wide variety of plant species would result in growth in a dense forest, which grows naturally in 300 years, is created in 30 to 35 years. Actually, natural forests a natural forest can be created in 300 years. However, through the Miyawaki method, we can create any natural forest within 30 to 35 years. Otherwise, it would take around 300 years, and that could be the best advantage of this Miyawaki method. Now, when we can grow dense forest within 30 to 35 years, so that could also have a huge positive environmental impacts, in the sense that they absorb excessive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Thereby they help playing an important role as a natural carbon sink. So because understand that trees absorb carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and they release oxygen, and at the same time whatever carbon dioxide that they have absorbed through the process of photosynthesis, they store the carbon in their roots and the stem and branches, leaves and everywhere. So therefore they absorb a lot of carbon in their lifetime. So these trees grow 10 times faster, and they actually absorb 30 times more carbon dioxide than the natural forest through this Miyawaki method. In fact, the Miyawaki method is identified as one of the potential method of forestation where we can significantly increase the forest cover and the density of the forest. So in fact, the density of the forest is 30 times that of a normal tree plantations, thereby further enhancing the potential of the plants to absorb more and more carbon dioxide. Now in India, the Miyawaki forests are actually found in Vadodara, Gujarat. Okay, so there was a private farm, Sun Pharma Road, 1200 square feet, and then 16,000 square feet at VMC's Rajiv Nagar STP Harni. Okay, so these are some of the models of the Miyawaki method of forestation. Now in this image also you can see how the Miyawaki forests are actually grown. So soil of a future forest is analyzed and improved. This is the first step, and the second step is that 50 to 100 local plant species or native plant species are planted in a random mix, and a site would be monitored continuously for 2 to 3 years, and then increased competition encourage the faster growth of the plant species which are actually grown on a piece of land. And within a span of 30 to 35 years, the forests would grow, and that could absorb a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they also play a very important role in further enhancing the biodiversity of an area. Now in India also there were efforts to promote forest through this Miyawaki method of forestation, and this is a very important method. So today's prelims practice question is considered under the Constitution, concentration of wealth violates which of the following rights, right? So first statement says it violates the right to equality. Second says the directive principles of state policy, and statement C says that the right to freedom, and statement D, the concept of welfare would be violated by the concentration of wealth. See, this is a very simple question. If you have already read the directive principles of state policy, the fundamental rights and the fundamental duties, you can easily answer this question. So please answer the question in the comment section. Try to answer these questions so that would result in a healthy participation in the discussion, right? So try to answer this question in the comment section, and I'll be providing you the correct answer in tomorrow's class. So the first very important article that we are starting this discussion is with the editorial on inequality, right? So the author in this article has been suggesting that there are a huge level of inequalities prevailing in India, and those inequalities must not be ignored. Why? Because as I have already told you in previous lectures that top 1% of India's wealthy actually own around 40 percentage of the national wealth. So that is a huge amount of national wealth is owned by top 1% of the populations. So that is how the concentration of wealth has been growing and inequalities have been growing in India, right? So what is the context of this particular editorial? So the context is that recently the Congress party has announced the Nyaya Patra manifesto. Okay, so this Nyaya Patra manifesto has actually sparked the debate on the inequality in India and the concept of wealth redistribution. Now in any country, so wealth is distributed equitably across different sections or different segments, then there will not be enough or there will not be any concentration of the wealth in few hands. However, in India, the problem is that there is a poor wealth redistribution, and that has been resulting in the concentration of wealth in very few hands, and that is further driving inequality in India. So therefore it has a lot of concerns, and that has also created a lot of economic disparities in India. Now how it is a concern and how it has created a lot of disparities, we will understand very briefly. Okay, so wealth redistribution and taxation problems in India that were existing in India. Now if you look at some of the statistics with respect to inequality in India, So according to the World Inequality Database, so that was released in the year 2022 and 23. So this particular inequality database has revealed that 22.6 percentage of the national income, so not national wealth but national income, 22.6 percentage of the national income went to the top 1 percentage of India's rich, and in fact it is highest since 1922. And apart from this national income, now if you look at the wealth of the people or wealth of the top 1 percentage, it is said that top 1% population having 40.1 percentage share in the total wealth. Now whenever you confront or whenever you are being asked a question, mains question with respect to inequality, you just write these statistics in the introduction, thereby making it more and more impactful. Now the problem with respect to wealth concentration in a very few hands is because there is a poor wealth redistribution among the different sections of the society. So that is the major problem or the main problem that has been resulting in the concentration of wealth in few hands. So when it has concentrated in few hands, that could create a huge economic disparities among the people or economic disparities among the different sections of the society, and that must be tackled here. And after that, we must understand the other thing is that low tax to GDP ratio is another concern that India has been facing. Now if you look at the India's total tax collection, it is a very less compared to all other developing countries. So India has a very low tax to GDP ratio compared to all other middle income countries. And at the same time, if you look at the taxation system, it is also regressive in nature. The taxation system is regressive in nature. Now when I say taxation system is regressive in nature, so this essentially means that the majority of the taxes are actually paid by the poor instead of the wealthy people. So that is the regressive taxation, because if wealthy people are taxed based on their income, so that is known as the progressive taxation. So based on their income, based on their wealth levels, taxes would be imposed on the wealthy people, so that is known as progressive taxation. But on the other hand, India has seen the higher levels of regressive taxation, that is majority of the poor face the burden of taxation through indirect taxes. Now even if you look at the total tax collections in India, the indirect taxes are actually have a lion's share, or they have the majority share. So the direct taxes are very less. The contribution of direct taxes that are being paid by the wealthy individuals is a very low compared to majority of the middle income countries, and that has been the major factor in low tax to GDP ratio. And at the same time, it has also been indicating regressive taxation structure. So after that, spending on welfare and social sector is very low compared to the other countries. Now whenever we are having a lesser revenues to spend on the social welfare sector, or whenever we have a lesser tax collection, then of course we have to compromise on some of the social welfare spending, and that is what we have been seeing in India. So apart from existing inequalities, absence of government support in terms of social sector spending is another concern that has been further aggravating or further exacerbating or increasing existing inequalities in India. So however, we must require employment centered growth and the social spending as well. So the growth is very important here, but the growth must be employment centered, and we must emphasize on social sector or social welfare spending, and that is how we can address the existing inequalities in the society or in the country. Now employment creation is very important for any country, right? So higher levels of unemployment would lead to problems like poverty and lack of basic necessities, and at the same time social unrest. It would also create social unrest, and we will not be able to use the existing demographic dividend in an efficient and effective manner. So all those challenges would be created by unemployment or lack of enough employment opportunities. So therefore our government must focus on creating viable employment opportunities for our youth population, thereby better using the existing demographic dividend. So for that we must emphasize on skill development, especially the vocational training. So that must be focused, and we should also look at development of the human resources by emphasizing on education and the healthcare sectors. And we must focus on further encouraging entrepreneurship by various programs such as Startup India, Stand Up India and Make in India program. A government actively extending financial support and at the same time training for the purposes of marketing. And in this aspect, self-help group women can actually play one of the most important and instrumental role. So therefore we must prioritize job creation and also ensure the equitable growth. So that is how we can ensure that these inequalities would not further result in creating stark inequalities among different sections of the society, and that could also result in the inclusive development if we focus on employment generation, employment creation. Because see, when we focus on employment creation and gainful employment opportunities are being provided for the people, so along with ensuring inclusive development, so this would also enhance India's growth and economic development, because these employment opportunities very often ensure social security and social safety nets for the populations, and that is very, very important in this context, especially for India, where it has a highest youth population in its working age. So for that the government has to take certain measures, especially the social welfare measures, and also employment generation, employment creation and human resources development. So in this context, very important that government must prioritize the job creation through the direct employment schemes. So we must focus on direct employment schemes. For example, in urban areas, National Rural Livelihoods Mission, and in rural areas, in urban areas, Urban Livelihoods Mission, National Urban Livelihoods Mission. So this National Rural Livelihoods Mission is also known as Ajivaka Mission. So therefore we must focus on further strengthening the employment opportunities through these programs along with several other government programs. And we should also bolster the existing public services such as focus on healthcare, education and social security, and they could help us reduce the levels of unemployment, and they could also help ensure that everyone have adequate opportunities to develop themselves and reduce the existing inequalities and concentration of wealth in the country. And after that, the other very important thing is that we must emphasize on employment centered growth related aspects. So to address this inequality, we must focus on employment centered growth patterns. So that I've already explained through different means how we can promote employment. See, not just public employment but private employment or entrepreneurship development is very important in this context. Okay, so that's all in this article. And next important article is with respect to the green growth and Reserve Bank of India's monetary policies role in ensuring India's transition to green growth. Now very briefly, if I can tell you what exactly is this green growth. So green growth means that environmentally sustainable growth rate or environmentally sustainable growth, so that would not harm the environment, and that would reduce the use of fossil fuels, and it would make a transition into a green economy that involves lesser costs. Okay, so this transition involves lesser costs, thereby in the longer term identifying the risks which are being associated with this transition, and at the same time preparing the country for green growth, and that is a very important goal to achieve in the longer term. And in this context, economy must be prepared to make a a rapid transition into the green growth or green development. Now in this context, we'll understand the role of the Reserve Bank of India. Now what is the context of this article? Recently, Reserve Bank of India has highlighted the significant impact of climate change on economy. Now see, climate change had a huge impact on the, or it has a huge impact on the economic growth and economic development. So we all knew about that. So how climate change actually impact? For example, climate change has very often resulted in erratic rainfall. So this erratic rainfall creates drought-like conditions, and that could reduce the agriculture productivity, and even it would lead to the crop failures. Now, whenever there were crop failures due to the climate change, what generally happens? That could significantly increase inflation of the agriculture products, or food inflation would be significantly increased. And at the same time, growing inflation, to tackle this growing inflation, what RBI will do? RBI will increase the interest rates to tackle the inflation in the economy. So in order to increase the interest rates, what RBI do? RBI will squeeze out all the money from the economy, and that could make the investment, that could make new investments a very costly affair, and that would discourage new investments, because if anyone wanted to take a loan from a bank, that could cost high rate of interest for private investors. So that could significantly reduce investments and infrastructure facilitation, and that could even slow down the economic growth and development, because people will not have enough money, and at the same time the prices would also be higher. That could significantly reduce the demand in the economy. Significant decline in the demand actually means decline in the productivity, or a decline in production capacity of various industrial units. Declining production further would lead to the layoff of employees. So all these factors are being associated with the climate change and the negative effect on the economy. Now RBI has rightly understood the negative effect of climate change on the economy and economic growth. So therefore, what RBI has done, it has emphasized on the need to address extreme weather events and other climate shocks. Now for that, what RBI will do? RBI needed actually the consideration to understand the economic impact of climate change. So RBI has published a report, and this particular report by RBI actually underlines the importance of considering all the climate risks in monetary policy. See, the Monetary Policy Committee, what actually do? So it actually takes a stock of the situation. It analyzes the existing levels of inflation, because please understand that inflation target is 4%, with the upper and lower tolerance levels of +2 and -2. So therefore, the Monetary Policy Committee's overall responsibility is to maintain this levels of inflation, and at the same time also ensure the stability of prices. Stability of prices and stable economic growth are some of the targets of the, or goals of the Monetary Policy Committee. However, these extreme weather events and other climate shocks, what they have been doing, they have been increasing the inflation in the economy. So the climate change leads to the inflation in the economy, would force this particular Monetary Policy Committee to change their policy stance. Okay, so how they change their policy stance in order to curtail the inflation, growing levels of inflation? What they will do? So they will now suggest a higher policy rate, or so this higher policy rate would actually make new loans very costly, because now banks charge higher rate of interest on new loans. So there will be no investment in future, and no infrastructure development, and poor private capital formation would actually takes place. So because of the growing inflation that is primarily caused by the climate change. And after that, the macroeconomic impact should also be understand. So in fact, the new Keynesian model, okay, so Keynes is an economic scientist, and this new Keynesian model actually incorporating the physical climate risk and damage function to estimate the macroeconomic impact of the climate change. See, we must understand the macroeconomic impact of the climate change, and that could projecting, that is actually projecting a potential 9% lower long-term output by 2050 without the mitigation policies. Now we have to understand the negative impact of the climate change, and if we do not take any adaptation and mitigation policies, so that could severely hit India's overall growth prospects in the future, so until 2050. So see, this is a challenge, and we must understand this challenge, and we must also adopt certain measures to deal with such challenges. Now in this context, we should also understand the other thing is that there are a lot of reports, and those reports are actually warning about inflation hysteresis. So that could lead to de-anchoring of inflation, and at the same time it necessitates higher interest rates to curb inflation and resulting a greater output loss. See, every aspect of this particular article has been emphasizing on climate change, and climate change is associated with the adverse environmental impacts or adverse weather changes, and how they are further driving the inflation or increasing inflation in the economy, and what are the measures that Monetary Policy Committee adopts to control inflation in the economy would further deteriorate the facilitation of investment in the economy, right? So this is what has been emphasized here. So however, the other thing is that, so we know, in order to ensure green growth, the government has launched certain programs. Okay, so those programs include PM Pranam was launched. Okay, so this PM Pranam program actually incentivizes states and union territories, and that this will promote alternatives to the fertilizers. So this is one thing that could ensure facilitate green growth. And after that, the government has also set up 500 new waste to wealth plants as well. So this is part of the Gobardhan scheme. So Gobardhan scheme essentially emphasizes on waste to wealth creation in the economy, and that could further promote the circular economy. So after that, we have discussed several times that the government has also launched the green credit program to incentivize the positive environmental contributions by the people in terms of afforestation, waste management, and those things. And after that, the government has also launched the mangrove initiative for sustainable habitats and tangible incomes. Okay, so this is especially with respect to mangrove conservation and protection. So these are some of the programs which could ensure the green growth in India. However, what are the RBI, Reserve Bank of India's efforts towards this green economy? Okay, so there were a number of approaches that are being adopted by Reserve Bank of India to ensure the green economy. Okay, so actually, Reserve Bank of India through its monetary policy has been gradually addressing the transition into green economy since it has released its discussion paper in 2022. So therefore, it has identified the climate risks that are involved and the impact of these climate risks on the economic growth and economic development, and RBI has also been exploring various options for the sustainable finance. So these methods could actually ensure a greater green transition of India in the long term. So in fact, there are several green methods that were adopted by RBI, and these green methods actually acknowledges India's need for around 17 trillion US dollars. India's need for 17 trillion US dollars to achieve net zero emissions. Now in this context, what exactly is the net zero emissions? See, as part of our Panchamrut commitments, we have announced that we will become net zero by 2070. So this was announced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi at a Glasgow summit. So net zero actually means that whatever carbon we emit, the same amount of the carbon would be absorbed from the atmosphere through different methods. That is net zero, and India aimed to become net zero by 2070, but RBI says that we require around 17 trillion. That is actually a huge amount, and in fact India's total GDP is around 3.75 trillion per annum. Okay, but 17 trillion is huge, and if India wanted to become net zero by 2070, we require around 17 trillion. So in this context, RBI, Reserve Bank of India, has introduced a lot of initiatives like sovereign gold bond scheme and expanded participation in green securities by the foreign institutional investors. However, there are certain measures that are required in this context. So those measures include RBI focusing on quantitative and the qualitative impact of climate change. So RBI actually assess the quantitative and qualitative impact of climate change on economic growth as well as economic development of India. Now, when we are able to understand or assess the qualitative and quantitative impact, then we can come up with possible solutions to mitigate the risks which are being associated with the climate change on economic growth and economic development, and we must adopt a set of mitigation and adaptation plans, and we must gradually push ourselves to achieve a greater green growth, and we should also make a rapid transition to green growth, and that is how India could achieve its target of becoming net zero by 2070. Okay, so our focus should be on development, but development should takes into consideration mitigation and adaptation of climate change, and we should also make a rapid transition towards the green growth. And in this context, the Reserve Bank of India actually have the key role. So the next important news article is with respect to a growing trade deficit between India and China. Okay, so India-China trade deficit. Now, briefly, what exactly is this trade deficit? So trade deficit essentially means that our exports are less than what we import. Okay, so they are less than what we import from China. So this essentially means that, in a very simple terms, imagine that we have been importing around $100 billion worth of goods from China per annum, but on the other hand we are just exporting $20 billion worth of goods to China. Now in this context, the trade deficit is actually $80 billion, right? So that is a huge dependence on China, and now the trade is in favor of China because China is just importing 20 billion worth of goods from India, but on the other hand India has been importing 100 billion worth of goods from China. So therefore this trade deficit is a huge concern for India. We must reduce our dependence on China, and we must also ensure the supply chain resilience, and how this supply chain resilience could actually reduce India's long-term dependence on China, and we will understand this with some data and statistics. Okay, so recently India's exports from China actually crossed 101 billion in the financial year 23-24. So earlier India's imports from China just 70 billion 18-19 financial year, but now in 23-24 financial year, so these have crossed to 101 billion US dollars. So therefore the country's share in industrial goods imports has risen from 21% to 30% in last 15 years. So this indicating a higher degree of dependence on China for our imports, and that is not good in the longer term. So goods imports from China have actually risen to 2.3 times faster than India's total imports. Now see, despite we being emphasizing on Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan and self-reliant India and supply chain resilience, it is very concerning that India's imports from China have significantly increased. So, and that could further widen India's trade deficit. Okay, so this trade deficit is a concern that has been indicating a huge dependence on India. So actually a study noted that India's total imports from China have significantly increased. So they have reported that 2.3 times increase in imports in last 15 years. And in fact, China is the top supplier of 18 major industrial sectors in India. So they include the machineries, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, textiles. And in fact, there was a general perception that Chinese imports are high only in the electronic sector. So this is not the case. So what was the general perception? The general perception is that Chinese imports are very high in the electronic segment, but this is not true. We have been importing other industrial items also from China. They include machinery, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and textiles. And in fact, India's growing industrial imports from China between the financial years 2018-19 and 2023-24. So actually they have actually made that India's exports to China have stagnated around 16 billion. Okay, so I mean we have not made any rapid or significant progress in respect of promoting India's exports to China, and that is a key concern here. Okay, so India's exports to China are actually stagnated at just 16 billion per annum. However, our imports from China are actually surged or increased manifold, and that is resulted in cumulative trade deficit, and in fact the trade deficit exceeding around or ranging between 387 billion over the last 6 years. So that is a huge trade deficit for India with any country. However, if you look at India's exports to China, they actually increased in the past year, particularly in 90 principal commodities out of total 161 items shipped to the country by India. Okay, so India's exports to China have registered a positive rate of growth in 90 principal goods. So these 90 principal commodities accounted for 67.7% of India's total export basket. So they actually include, we export iron ore to China, telecom instruments, and electronic components, and these are some of the major exports of India from India to China. Now in this context, if you can look at some data with respect to India's total merchandise imports, so they stood at around 677 billion 23-24. See, these imports are not just from China alone, but in this particular financial year 23-24, our total merchandise imports from different countries is US dollar 677.2 billion. So of this, 15% or 101 billion worth of goods were sourced from China alone. So that is actually a huge dependence on one single country. Okay, so after that, the 42% of India's textile and clothing imports, so whatever we import in the segment of textile and clothing, 42% of our imports are from China, and 40% of the machinery imports in this particular period are actually from China. And the electronics and telecom and electrical products, so they actually contribute 38.4%. Total imports of India are actually from China. And in fact, China also accounted for 29.2% of chemicals, pharmaceutical imports to India, and 25.8% of plastic products, and 23.3% of automobile sector inbound shipments. So see, all this data has been pointing out that we have a significantly dependent on imports from China. and in the long term this will impact Indian economy negatively, because Chinese imports are actually flooding into the Indian markets, and they also impacting the domestic economy and domestic manufacturing sectors as well. Okay, so domestic manufacturing, because if you look at the Chinese products, they are more competitive than the domestically manufactured products. So therefore they will impact Indian economy and domestic manufacturing in the longer term. So in the era where Indian government planning to support the domestic manufacturing through programs like Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. So it is very important that we must reduce our import dependence on China. We must emphasize on domestic manufacturing. We must encourage the domestic manufacturing of the imported items. For that, the government should extend tax incentives and other financial incentives, encourage them, and we must also encourage the micro, small and medium enterprises in India. And in the longer term, we must reduce our dependence on China, and that is crucial for India's overall economic growth. And we have to understand that we must reassess India's import strategies. And when we reassess India's import strategies, so that will play a very important role in mitigating the future economic risks that we face, and at the same time it would also bolster the industries and reduce the dependency on a single country for imports. Okay, so this is how we can go forward or proceed forward. Now the next important news article is with respect to anticyclones hanging even now over India, link warming to heat. See, now we have been increasingly observing heat wave like conditions in different parts of our country. However, so anticyclones are actually responsible for the heat wave like conditions in different parts of our country. Now we'll understand what exactly is the context of this particular article. So the context is that the waning phase of strong El Nino. Now what exactly is the El Nino? So El Nino is an abnormal heating of the Eastern Pacific Ocean and the Western Pacific Ocean. Now in a general circumstance, what generally happens, the Eastern Pacific Ocean, that is the western coast of South America, would come under the influence of cold current, and the Western Pacific Ocean would come under the influence of warm current. So therefore, this could further augment the Indian monsoon in receiving good rainfall. But on the other hand, in strong El Nino years, what happens? The Eastern Pacific Ocean, that is the western coast of South America, would come under the influence of warm ocean current, and the Western Pacific Ocean would come under the influence of cold ocean currents, and that could result in dry winds and lesser monsoon rainfall over the Indian subcontinent. So this waning phase of strong El Nino 2023 actually brings the expected warm temperatures across the globe. However, we have been seeing the cooler temperature spread from Pakistan, India, West Bengal during the March times. Okay, so now understand global warming is a phenomenon where the temperatures of this planet have been significantly increasing, and the global warming has actually creating a unique features, and they have a huge impact on heat waves and increasing or further driving up the temperatures in different parts. Okay, so in fact during March, an anticyclonic circulations over the northern Indian Ocean, right? So if you look at this is Indian Ocean, the northern Indian Ocean, so there were anticyclonic circulations. Okay, so they were drivers of unusual rainfall over the Odisha in March, and these anticyclone has winds moving in a clockwise direction. Okay, but on the other hand, in cyclones, the winds move in the anti-clockwise direction. And at the same time, if you look at cyclones, it creates a low pressure area and there will be a converging air. But on the other hand, anticyclones, so they have a huge high pressure area in contrast to the cyclone, and they also see the diverging air. Okay, so the winds move in clockwise direction and air sinking down in the middle of this high pressure area. As this air actually hits the ground, it compressed and then warmed and can create a high pressure heat like a dome. So this dome would trap the heat and that would create a heat wave like conditions. So these anticyclones actually exist over the northern Indian Ocean and even on Indian subcontinent as well, and that is one of the key contributor of increasing temperatures on India. So how these anticyclones are being formed? So there's some phenomena through which these anticyclones are formed. So during the pre-monsoon season generally starts in March and April times. Okay, so during this pre-monsoon times or pre-monsoon season, the upper level Indian easterly jet streams. So these Indian easterly jet streams actually flow from the east to west. So these Indian easterly jet streams begins to take shape in the upper layers of the atmosphere at around 10-degree north latitudes. And at the same time they flow from Arabian Sea, peninsular India and Bay of Bengal. So this is how they flow in the 10-degree north latitude. However, there was a strong westerly jet stream exist in the northern part of India. Okay, so that exists around 30-degree north of the Indian subcontinent. And these two, the Indian easterly jet streams and the westerly jet streams, they can generate an anticyclonic pattern over the Indian Ocean and the Indian subcontinent. Okay, so these westerly jet streams and at the same time Indian easterly jets integrated or combined together, they can create an anticyclonic pattern over the Indian Ocean and the Indian subcontinent. So therefore this is actually creating conditions of heat wave over the Indian subcontinent. So the westerly jet is pushed north during the monsoon season and Indian easterly jet dominates the Indian subcontinent during the monsoon season. Okay, so in fact during this pre-monsoon season there will be a strong anticyclonic circulation that can bring dry and hot weather over many parts of India, while a weak anticyclone produces a milder weather. So we have already understood how these anticyclones are actually formed. Okay, so they will have a diverge the form of air, and that particular sinking air if it hits the ground, and there will be a high pressure dome would be developed, and this dome would trap the heat and increase heat wave like conditions. Now how these anticyclonic winds were actually formed? They formed by the combination of westerlies and Indian easterly jet streams. So the impact of El Nino, so that is differential heating on the of the Eastern Pacific Ocean and Western Pacific Ocean, that is El Nino during the pre-monsoon demise on Indian easterly jet tends to produce a stronger and more persistent anticyclone, so thereby long lasting and more intense heat waves. Okay, so there are different stages of early warning. So the stages of early warning or the method or the system that we actually adopt is a 3-step approach, that is ready, set, go system. So this is actually a 3-step system that we normally adopt, and this ready, set, go system actually involves preparing a system and guiding the National Disaster Management Authority, and that requires this 3-step approach to function efficiently and more effectively. So the first step, so that is the ready. So this particular step actually provides a seasonal outlook such as global warming and El Nino, and with that seasonal outlook we can maximize our accuracy with respect to these extreme weather events. And this ready step actually involves the National Disaster Management Authority, local agencies and all government bodies ready for their disaster response system in case of any untoward incidents took place. The second step is set step, and this actually involves resources allocation, identifying potential hotspots so that we can move resources, including personal allocation of resources and mobilizing personnel to ensure the disaster preparedness. And after that, the go step, and that is based on short and medium range forecasts. So this particular step, everything hits the road to manage a disaster, including rescue efforts, hydration center and heat shelters, everything a part of the ready set go approach of the disaster management. Okay, so preparedness and recovery is also very important, because India's prediction system and early warning systems have made a significant improvements in recent times. And in fact, the National Disaster Management Authority has actually worked on these details into ready, set, go system. And apart from that, there are certain challenges. Those challenges have to be addressed. And in order to meet those challenges, we must build resilience for the future by better predicting the trajectory of weather at every location over India. And apart from that, the coordination between national and neighborhood levels over the early warning is very important. And in this respect, the governments, local departments, people at large need to be trained and engaged with make this a sustained success. Okay, so this is what we have to do with respect to the preparedness and recovery and the emergency management with respect to any disaster. Okay, so that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. So please like the video and also subscribe to our YouTube channel, and the PDF has been given in the description section. Thank you.